Hello everyone, and welcome back to another whiteboard video. Today, we're going to talk about why long length partial stretch training is overrated. Now, hang with me because we're going to go over three different sort of major segments of this video. The first segment is going to be some background on why this long length trend is a trend and what the benefits and upsides of it are. And then the second part is going to be me going into the details about why it's problematic for people to be making the conclusions that they are at the scale that they are. And then the third part is going to be about a case in favor of short position or squeeze position training. Okay, so I'll try to go over everything somewhat concisely, somewhat quickly, so this video doesn't end up being an hour long. First of all, why is this a thing? What are the perceived benefits? And what are the actual benefits as has been shown in research? Well, when we stretch muscles more, generally speaking, we're stronger, okay? So when we apply force to our bodies and exercise in more stretch positions, we're able to generate more total tension, right? Just in simple terms. And what does that lead to? That leads to higher levels of fatigue or higher levels of stretch and tension and mechanical tension, specifically in muscles, which in the case of growing muscle is generally a thumbs up, right? Because we stimulate a target tissue, the target tissue recovers, it grows, it gets bigger and stronger, right? Thumbs up. And by the way, fatigue oftentimes has like this negative association with it, which in certain contexts it can be. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to generate fatigue in the gym. Okay, so thumbs up there. And then also just overall function, overall muscular function. We want to get strong in all different kinds of positions. We want to be healthy humans. We want to be able to raise our arms up overhead or, perform squats, do daily activities. And so getting into different positions, I think overall is helpful for orthopedic health. Now, where does this start to go wrong? The reason I say that it's overrated and not unimportant and also not useful, the double negative there, it is useful, is because of these things. But where the problem is introduced occurs with something that I like to call the long length panacea. All right, so for those of you who don't know, the long length panacea, which is probably most of you, is basically the situation wherein every problem will lead back to getting a greater stretch. So what are the kinds of conclusions that people make? They basically say something like this, that number one, stretch position training is the best for hypertrophy, right? In a sort of blanket statement, it's the best in all circumstances, no matter what. That's the messaging that people are providing. And if it's not said explicitly, it's at least implied implicitly through videos like ranking system videos, where basically the top criteria is, does the muscle stretch fully and is it loaded most in the stretch? That's number one, within the long length. P for panacea, okay? Because it's advertised as a fix-all solution for all of your muscle growth problems. So that's the most problematic, and we'll talk about why it's problematic in just a second in part 3 of this when we talk about the benefits of short position training. Okay, so people saying it's the best for all instances, we got that. That's number one problem. Number two problem is that oftentimes, as I mentioned, longer length training is more fatiguing, right? Oh, Ben, wait, but you just said that, greater amounts of fatigue can be great in terms of hypertrophy. Yeah, absolutely. But what happens when you take all of your exercises and you apply the same exact approach to all of them? Well, not only do you miss training certain elements with certain benefits, we'll talk about in a second, but you also now are stacking exercises one on top of another that are not only probably also redundant with one another, but that are also exponentially greater in terms of the amount of fatigue. So in the first instance, we might assume that fatigue is useful, but if all of your exercises turn into this super high fatiguing kind of approach, you might not be able to recover at the same rate. You might be across different exercises not progressing as well because your fatigue leading into, let's say, a second or a third or a fourth exercise is so much higher, right? So there are many other things that we could go into here about potentially starting to develop some, ouchies, maybe some joint soreness that you don't normally have, right? Which of course you can adapt to, but overall, if you stack enough of these things on top of one another, the fatigue state, the sort of stress bucket might start to overflow. And then the third thing, and this is probably in terms of practical application the most damaging, is the research element of this. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you hear a lot of fitness influencers talking online about why we should train muscles in the stretch position, they often refer to the research. And there are a lot of problems with this, but the main one is what's known as a gross extrapolation, okay? So I'm gonna use one example, and I'm gonna reference and pull up a study here. And the study is by Cassiano and colleagues. And the title of the study is Greater Gastrocnemius Muscle Hypertrophy After Partial Range of Motion Training Performed at Longer Lengths. And basically what they did is they took a group of 42 younger women, I believe between the ages of 18 and 26. And what they had them do is a total of 9 sets per week, 3 sessions per week. On the straight knee calf raise, a leg press calf raise. And basically they divided in the 3 groups to a partial range of motion in the top percentages of the range of motion, meaning the most short position. So if you're doing a standing calf raise, kind of that top position, just sort of gyrating in the end range squeeze. The middle group used a full range of motion, all the way from bottom all the way to top. And then the third group basically just used the bottom half, where they were going from the most stretched position to basically like a neutral sort of mid-range position. And what they found in the study was that the most stretched approach, i.e. the approach where the ankles were most dorsiflexed or bent to that sort of partial range into the mid-range, that group grew their gastrocnemius, their outer calves, the most. And so what do people take away from this research? Or what recommendations do people make? They basically say, oh, because this, by the way, 8-week study done in 42 untrained women, because this specific study showed this thing, therefore everyone should do it all the time, and all of your calf raises for now and ever should be done in this manner. Okay, now that might sound a bit extreme, but that is essentially the language that people are using, is like, oh, this new study came out, therefore all of our things, all of our calf raise exercise variations should be in this particular manner. And even for muscle groups where this hasn't been super clearly elucidated in research, people are also extrapolating across muscle groups and saying, you know, similar things. And again, I'm not anti-long length training. I do plenty of long length partial training. But what I am anti is I'm anti gross extrapolation from research. I'm anti the long length panacea, imagining that all of these kinds of exercises are the only ones that we should be doing and we should be ignoring this, which I'll get to part 3 in just a second. But one of the biggest problems is a lack of understanding of research, okay? If you are an actual scientist, what you conclude is, this is what happened in this study, this is our speculation about what occurred in the study, and these are our tentative recommendations about what one might want to do. So is it perfectly acceptable in the case of the gastrocnemius study to say, hey, this study with this population for this timeline showed these results, and therefore you may want to implement this into your training. You may want to use this as a strategy that might be helpful. That would be perfectly reasonable and perfectly scientific, right? You're creating a speculation based off of the data that you received, right? That's a perfectly acceptable, normal thing to do. The problems start to come in when you start to say that this one study under this timeline within this population applies to everyone now and forever. And not only that, that you should now ignore all of this stuff over here, which has many benefits that are not being talked about. Okay, so again, even just one other simple example, if there are 52 weeks in a year and a study is 8 weeks long, what happens in all the other weeks in the year? Right? If my math is correct, 44 other weeks in the year. So it's like, okay, does this extrapolate out 44 weeks? Does this extrapolate out beyond the population that was assessed? Does it extrapolate out if a combination of those techniques are used? Does it change if it's 1 set versus 3 sets versus 2, right? All these are simply questions which should not prevent us from making recommendations and speculations, but should rather encourage speculation and encourage recommendation, all through a sort of more precise communication about just being hesitant to claim that you know that a certain thing will be best for everyone. Okay, so what is part 3 of this? Well, I want to talk about the benefits now of short position training, okay, that a lot of people are now totally ignoring, again, as a consequence of all this crap over here. So the number one benefit in my estimation, and these are all sort of linked together intimately, but the number one benefit is probably the region-specific element of short position training. So what does that mean? Well, if I am doing a press, I'm doing a dumbbell press, right? Just based on the anatomy and the function of my pecs, all of the pecs are going to be able to contribute substantially if I'm doing, let's say, like a horizontal variation. But now let's say that I have something like a cable and I'm bringing the cable across my body to a very specific portion, let's say toward my inner clavicle or toward my inner sternum or toward my lower pecs. The more specific you get to a short muscle length exercise, or the more closely you align yourself with a short position exercise, the more closely you align yourself with targeting a specific division of a specific muscle. So the same thing, let's say, applies to the glutes. The same thing could apply to the lats, right? If you are doing something like a leg press, right? All the different portions of your glute max are going to be well stimulated from a leg press. However, if you're doing something more like a cable kickback, perhaps at an angle that is slightly out and back to the side, that might be an exercise that is much more specific to the upper portions of the glute max, the region-specific stimulus, as compared to all of them overlapping. And you might say, well, Ben, why would you want to get less? Well, specifically because it's lower fatigue. And because if you're doing only high fatigue exercises and you are totally ignoring exercises which train a relatively shorter length at a more precise degree of location, right? So upper pecs versus middle pecs versus lower pecs, for example. Again, you may be sort of double, triple, quadruple dipping when you could be achieving all these other benefits at a lower relative cost. So another benefit of short position training is the fact that it's lower fatigue, which again, in certain contexts may not be as appropriate, but in other contexts, may be more appropriate. Like, let's imagine that you are basically like at the peak of the volume that you can handle. You may want to swap a long position exercise for a short position exercise so that you can still gain the benefits of actually training a muscle without as much fatigue, right? And, you know, it's not so coincidental that all of the best bodybuilders throughout history have done both of these things. They've not just picked a side and made a bunch of conclusions about certain exercises being garbage because they're training at a shorter muscle length, right? So keep in mind that all of these studies are still showing growth in both at both ends of the extreme, but the results are obviously in certain instances tipped in favor of this one. But does that mean that we should just completely ignore the short position stuff in favor of the long position stuff? No, and in fact, on a per set basis, although this one may grow us more, depending on who you are, depending on the time frame, may or may not, this one may grow us just as much, if not more, especially if we're able to handle higher volumes of this one, right? So I'm just trying to lay out alternatives. I'm not trying to make a super strong, absolute certain claim here. And then the last one is just overall function, right? Getting stronger in all different kinds of positions is likely not ever going to be a bad thing, especially if you're just a normal average person who wants to be functional, walking around, without pain. And if you want to be someone who is able to sustain training for the longest term, you have to keep those kinds of things in mind, in my opinion. So I hope this overall framework makes sense. Again, I don't think that either one of these is good or bad. I just think that we should look at either of them, weigh the different upsides and downsides, and keep in mind this was a very, very, very short overview. I tried to be concise with it. So please let me know if you have any questions, and if you do, join my free community. Link is in the description below. I hope to see you in there. Are you someone that wants to be able to target any muscle in your body when you're lifting, but you also don't give a shit about complicated anatomy and biomechanics? If you are, then this is the perfect ebook for you. The Target Any Muscle ebook is not really an ebook. It's more like a lifetime cheat sheet guide to lifting. You need a total of 0 understanding of anatomy and biomechanics to understand this material. And that's because every chapter is full of tons of different diagrams and very visual, simple explanations about how to set up an exercise for any muscle. In addition, every chapter functions as a standalone guide, so so you can simply click on the table of contents and navigate to any muscle group that you're training on any given day. Every single chapter includes visuals of how to stretch any muscle, how to shorten any muscle, how to load any muscle, and then how to stabilize your body so that you can train that muscle appropriately. And in addition, at the end of every chapter, there's a training FAQ to address commonly asked questions and a full video lecture summarizing each chapter with me and my skeleton model to demonstrate. This is meant to function as a cheat sheet for life. This should be the last product that you ever purchase about how to lift. I hope you all enjoy the guide. Happy gains.